So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paolo Frankel. I'm the head of the Renewable Energy Division at the IEA. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this fourth event of the WEO week, focused on sectoral transition to new energy industries. Now, the emergence of a new economy is the key theme of this year's WEO. In this session, we aim to discuss how the energy sector is changing and what this means for both existing and emerging energy industries. We have a number of examples ranging from hydrogen, green cement, CCUS, and fast electric vehicle chargers. However, while the direction of travel is clear, the pace of technology change and the stringency of policy are still uncertain. And new energy industries still need to move from prototypes to commercial readiness at scale, with policy and regulation being critical. So the objective of today, this session will discuss the prospects and challenges for the emergence of new energy industries. My colleagues, Ms. Stephanie Buchert and Mr. Tim Goodson, will make a presentation of the key findings from the World Energy Outlook 2021, which will be followed by a moderated discussion. We have the fortune to have three distinguished panelists, Dr. Martin Pey, Ms. Christelle Verstraeten, Mr. Bjorn Otto Sverdrup, who will share with us their experience in navigating the energy transition, respectively in the steel, electric mobility, and gas and oil industry. So with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to my colleagues, Tim and Stephanie, for making their presentation of the key results of the WEO on industry sectors. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you all, and especially thanks to our panelists joining us today. So as mentioned, I'd like to kick off today's discussion with a short presentation with my colleague Stephanie, exploring some of the key findings related to sectoral transitions in this year's World Energy Outlook. So to start things off, a key message here is that under the current policies that are in place today, or policies that have been announced to date, global CO2 emissions from the energy sector are set to end this decade higher than they are today. We're not yet bending the needle in this decade. And then going through to 2050, CO2 emissions are set to be just a little bit below where we are at today's level. Now, the picture is very different when we start looking at a sectoral level and by fuels. For example, solar PV and wind now offer us some of the cheapest ever sources of electricity. Their low costs and supportive policies result in declining emissions from the power sector through to 2030 and beyond in this stated policy scenario. Now, the same is true for the building sector, where mature and increasingly cost-competitive technologies to improve efficiency and electrify energy use lead to lower emissions, even in this step scenario. However, the same cannot be said for the transport and the industry sectors, which concentrate many of the most hard to decarbonize uses of energy. Here we can think of heavy freight transport, aviation, iron and steel, cement, and other industrial processes. However, in this year's WEO, we've explored the impact of the announced pledges, so announced net zero pledges made by countries to date, and updated and increased ambition in countries' nationally determined contributions. So with close to 70% of global CO2 emissions now covered by announced net zero pledges, and around 120 countries having submitted new or updated NDCs, we're seeing the emissions curve starting to bend. Such pledges are sufficient to move the needle for all sectors. And by 2030, global emissions are lower than today and 2.6 gigatons lower than in the steps. Now, pledges specific to the power sector see it lead the way in terms of emissions reductions in this APS scenario. And while pledges to end the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles in around 34 countries hasten the decline in CO2 emissions from passenger cars. Now, despite this progress across certain sectors, the APS closes less than 20% of the emissions gap between the steps and what we need to achieve net zero by 2050. Emissions in the APS in 2050 are only 40% lower than they are today. So additional ambition is needed across all sectors and regions. to achieve net zero, as countries with pledges and those without are each responsible for about half of the remaining gap between the announced pledges scenario and the NZE. Now, to close this gap and to put sectors on a pathway towards net zero, the 2020s, the coming decade, needs to be the decade of massive clean energy expansion. Delivering the required emissions reductions relies on a whole suite of technologies and measures that differ across each sector. However, one commonality across all sectors is the need for a step change in the rates of energy efficiency improvement. All sectors see energy demand increase between today and 2030 in the stated policy scenario. An accelerated energy efficiency in the APS, and even more so in the NZE, significantly mitigate this energy demand growth. In the building sector, for example, energy efficiency improvements, notably via retrofits and zero carbon ready new buildings, reduce energy demand below today's level in the NZE. Now, electrification also contributes to reducing energy demand, as in the majority of cases, electric technologies are far more efficient than fossil fuel powered alternatives. For example, heat pumps are 3 to 4 times more efficient than a gas boiler. And today's electric cars use on average 70% less energy to travel 1 kilometre than a conventional car. As a result, energy demand for road transport in the NZE with much higher adoption of electric vehicles is lower than it is today. Now, of course, the benefits of electrification for energy sector emissions are multiplied as the electricity sector decarbonises. Nonetheless, not all end uses can be easily electrified, and technologies such as carbon capture, utilisation and storage are critical to reducing emissions from sectors such as iron and steel, especially when it comes to addressing emissions from existing plants. Low carbon fuels also play a role with increased use of biomethane, hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels such as ammonia. These fuels are used in industrial facilities, in power stations and for heavy freight transport and shipping. And looking at aviation, emissions reductions rely on considerable increase in the use of low carbon synthetic fuels and advanced biofuels, while behavioural changes are also needed to reduce demand. Now, we know what technologies and other measures are needed to put the world on a net zero pathway. But as we've seen clearly from the previous figures, announced pledges to date are far from sufficient to put us on this pathway. Announced pledges are shifting the needle, but they're not enough to hit the key milestones that we've outlined in May with the publication of our net zero roadmap. Now, first, if we look at electric vehicles, 3 million electric cars were sold in 2020, accounting for just under 5% of total car sales. Now, we project this number to rise to over 20 million by 2030 under current and announced policies, while full achievement of announced emissions reduction pledges would push zero emissions vehicle sales to well above 30 million. Nonetheless, this remains well short of the 60 million electric and fuel cell electric cars sold in the NZE in 2030. In the NZE, this would be around 60% of global car sales, and well on the way to the milestone of ending internal combustion engine car sales by 2035 that we see in the NZE. Now, in the building sector, retrofitting buildings to bring them to a zero carbon ready building standard is critical to achieving net zero emissions for the sector. Now, such a standard means drastically improving the energy efficiency of our existing building stock, around half of which will still be standing when we get to 2050. In parallel, we also need to implement zero carbon ready codes for new buildings. Now, coming back to retrofits in the steps, there is some progress, particularly in the European Union. The 50 million homes retrofit to such standards represent around 1/5 of what is required in the NZE by 2030. Emissions reduction pledges see this share rise towards 50% in the APS, but we're still a long way from the increase in retrofits required to hit the NZE milestones. Retrofit rates would need to accelerate from less than 1% today to around 2.5% by 2030, with 250 million households retrofit to zero carbon ready building standards by this date. Now, turning to industry, many end uses in industry can be costly and technically difficult to electrify. So hydrogen is set to play a pivotal role here, especially when it comes to replacing coal use in iron and steel by shifts to hydrogen-based direct reduced iron. While the role of hydrogen remains limited to 2030, accelerating deployment of pilot plants this decade is critical to allow for a rapid ramp up post-2030. Now, the STEP sees hardly any progress in ramping up H2 beyond existing and planned pilot projects. But with announced pledges that see the realization of prominent hydrogen strategies, this goes further, but it still only brings us 1/10 of the level of H2 uptake that's needed in the NZE to keep net zero by 2050 in reach for the industry sector. Now, these examples here show that we're lagging on many fronts, but this doesn't need to be the case, and I'll now pass to Stephanie to explain why.
Indeed, as Timothy said, there is an ambition gap, but with the technologies that we have at hand today, this gap could, and in fact should, be much smaller. So for this World Energy Outlook, we have looked at sector by sector, region by region, looking at all the technologies that we have at hand to understand what share of this ambition gap of 14 gigaton of CO2 equivalent by 2030 between the announced pledge scenario and the net zero by 2050 scenario could be closed cost effectively. What does that mean in terms of additional EVs? What does that mean in terms of additional buildings retrofit or more efficient appliances, for example, without increasing total ownership costs for consumers? As it was shown already in some presentation of this World Energy Outlook, more than 40% of the ambition gap could be closed by cost-effective technologies, as long as policymakers put in place the right enabling conditions, of course. And we have seen from previous presentation that the electricity sector will deliver half of that cost-effective gap, but our analysis shows also that demand sectors, so notably transport, buildings, industry, play also a role in closing that gap. If we take the example of electric cars, almost an additional 60 million electric cars could be added to the global fleet over the next decade, and this with no cost for consumers. And this is in addition to the almost 200 million electric cars already deployed in the announced pledge scenario. So there is absolutely scope to increase the pace of electrification of road transport to both reduce emissions, but also to reduce bills for consumers. The same is true for buildings, where LEDs are more cost-effective than any other forms of lighting in just about every instance, and yet they don't represent all sales of light bulbs today. In the majority of cases, purchasing more efficient air conditioners or household appliances is also cost-effective. Now, turning to industry, we see a different story. There is a big challenge for the iron and steel industry sector, but also for other industrial sectors to find alternative low-emitting routes for their primary production processes, and increasing the cost-effectiveness of these production routes is really key to mitigate CO2 emissions without impacting prices and their competitiveness. So in our analysis, we have seen that while these production routes may not be cost effective by 2030, so that's something that you can see on the right-hand side figure, early action is really required to make these technologies available also in the longer term, noting also that more than half of these production routes, so I'm referring to smelting reduction equipped with CCUS, direct reduction iron with CCUS, or halogen-based direct reduced iron. So more than half of these innovative routes could be, in fact, cost-effective, but by 2050, so in the longer term. So now we have seen all this energy transition. We have looked at all the sectors, but to conclude this presentation, let's just take a step back to explore, in fact, all the impacts of this sectoral transition on global energy markets. So impacts of technology shifts, efficiency improvements, and other measures. If we take them separately, they may look small in terms of impact, but looking at the global picture, the next decade could really observe an important shift for global energy markets. So in the case of the steps, so under the current policy environment, if we keep that, we see that oil demand exceeds soon the 2019 level, so the level that we had before the pandemic, that natural gas could be 50% higher in 2030 compared to today's, and that coal could rebound strongly in 2021, but never exceeding pre-pandemic level. And solar PV and wind will see a further expansion, meaning that these two sources will meet 3/4 of electricity demand growth. In the case of the APS, so already with the announced pledge, we could see quite some of changes. So in terms of oil, we will see oil peaking already by 2025, notably due to a reverse trend of oil use for cars. So Tim has mentioned the 34 countries that have now put on the table targets to stop sales of IC vehicles by a certain date, and this has implications on the oil market. For natural gas, we see also that natural gas could peak just after 25, and this comes from the power sector, but also the building sector. For the power sector, with an increasing share of renewables to meet additional electricity demand. And for the building sector, as Tim mentioned, from more efficient buildings by then. In the case of coal, we see that coal will be even lower than in the steppes, of course. In the case of solar PV and wind, they will continue to their further expansion, meeting all the electricity demand growth by 2030 and having an annual capacity addition reaching almost 500 gigawatts. So with all of that, we can also take now a more historical step back and remember that in 1990, the share of fossil fuels was 81%. And 30 years after, so today, big news, that share has dropped to 79%. So only 2 percentage points lower. So not a big change. And already in the case of the APS, we will observe an important change because the share of fossil fuels by 2030 will drop to close to 70%. So quite an important change in the next decade compared to the 3 previous decades. But this remains still far from what we will observe under a net zero pathway, so under the net zero by 2050 scenario that we have published in May, where the share of fossil fuels will reach 60% by 2030. And as you can see, the picture for energy markets is dramatically different already in the next decade in an NZD world. Faster electrification of road transport will have important implications, of course, on oil demand. A faster decarbonization of the power sector will have implication on gas, coal, and solar and wind. A faster energy efficiency improvement in terms of building sector will have also implication in the case of gas and higher electrification, meaning that in the case of solar PV and wind, they will have to meet additional demand from further electrification of the building sector, of the industry sector, and from the transport sector. And in parallel, they will have to address the reduction of fossil fuel generation. So this will mean that we will require a quadrupling of solar PV and wind deployment, as my colleague Brent Warner showed yesterday. So the scale of the change required in the next decade for the energy system is huge. But we have reason to remain optimistic. The pathway to keep the door to 1.5 degree open is narrow, but as our director said, achievable. In the last 2 years, we have seen a lot of announcements, a lot of pledges. Now let's walk the talk and enter the decade of action, implementing policies to meet announced pledge and raising ambitions in line with the net zero target. There is just no time to waste. Thanks for your attention, and Paulo, I'll give you back the floor now, and looking forward to the discussion with our panelists.
Many thanks, Stephanie and Tim, for this very informative presentation and for sticking to the time as well. So I would like now to go to the moderated discussion by presenting our distinguished panelists. Before then, we open the floor to the audience. The first panelist is Dr. Martin Pei, who is Executive Vice President and CTO of SSAB, a Swedish leading steel company, and Dr. Pei is there since 2001, occupying several management positions. Now, the steel industry is no doubt at the center of the energy transition. It plays a very obvious role in our economy and in our modern life. And at the same time, it is responsible for a high level of emission and pollution. Now, could you please elaborate on the prospects, but also the challenges for green steel? And what has been in particular the experience of SSAB and Hybrid in working on a prototype scale, and how you are planning to move to commercial readiness? I kindly ask you to limit your notes to 3-4 minutes. Martin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you for this very important discussion, and I'm happy to be invited to share what we have done so far. As you mentioned earlier, steel is extremely important material. At the same time, steel production technology today that we are using to produce steel from iron ore is also emitting large amount of carbon dioxide. And that is mainly because that we are using coal or coke in the blast furnace process to reduce iron ore. While using recycled scrap, the emission is much lower, but recycled scrap is not enough. So we need to continue for quite some time in the future, continue with iron ore-based steel production. So they come to a conclusion that the industry really needs to develop a breakthrough technology. Only doing further incremental improvement of the blast furnace process will not be enough. We at SSAB have been working with this since a very long time, and our current production facilities in Sweden and Finland, based on the blast furnace process, are among the most efficient ones in terms of energy consumption, thereby CO2 emission. But we have still a very large portion of national emission in Sweden and Finland. So that's why we decided back in 2016 to collaborate with LKB, the mining company, and Vattenfall energy company. We created a hybrid initiative. Our aim is to use hydrogen instead of coal for iron ore reduction. And our aim is to decarbonize the whole value chain, from mining operations to steel production and all the way to supply fossil-free steel to our customers. We have done significant research work since then, and we have also invested in an extensive research program with pilot facilities. Since we started operating the pilot plants last year, we have been making quite important progress. And this summer, we have shown that using fully 100% hydrogen for iron ore reduction, producing carbon-free sponge iron, and use that for steel production has been shown possible at this pilot scale. Last week, Volvo Group showed the first vehicle made of this fossil-free steel to the world. And now we are planning, we have already started a long time back, a plan to make the big transformation step in 5 years' time. So 2026, our plan is to construct the first hybrid demonstration plant, which will produce 1.35 million tons of sponge iron using hydrogen only, and then make steel without using fossil fuel also in the following operation steps. Our customers have shown great interest in that. So now we see that by collaborating throughout the value chain, this can be realized. And our plan at SSAB is to transform our whole production system in Sweden, Finland, 3 production sites with blast furnaces before 2045, become fossil-free completely. So that is our plan.
Thank you so much for elaborating on this very ambitious plan. So we go to the next topic, which is electric mobility. So Ms. Christelle Verstraeten is Senior Director for European Policy at ChargePoint, the world's leading and most open, this is your definition, I guess, electric vehicle charging network. She was formerly Director for European Government Affairs and GE, and we were happy to have Christelle also as seconded colleague at the IEA. Now, Christelle, the deployment of infrastructure is very critical to the energy transition, and this is nowhere it is clearer than in the case of electric vehicles. Now, what are the main barriers that a private entity like you is facing? So, in other words, what can be done by the private sector, and what remains in the hands of the policy sector in terms of creating an enabling environment that enables investment in charging infrastructure? Could you a little bit elaborate on that? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Paolo and the team, for having me today. It's good to see some old familiar faces. Very topical argument and discussions today. I agree with you. It's a critical moment. And I think the number you have shown in terms of how electromobility can support the decarbonization target and to meet the climate pledge are really phenomenal. But you're right. It's the cars on the road and the charging infrastructure, and this needs to go hands in hands. I think the challenges that we're facing today, it's probably a patchwork of legislation across the different member states and countries around the globe, which are not really helping. There has been some issues also with standardization, even though it's improving, like the plugs for the cars, for example, have now been standardized. Probably some more to do on the heavy duty vehicle side. But overall, I would say that one of the key among the key drivers, also how policy can help to drive these investments from the private sector first. Well, I would say it's a combination. First, we need to have the cars on the roads. And I think that clear policies like the CO2 standards for new vehicles, like adopted in the EU, have already proven that it can really help to bring those cars on the market, because they provide visibility for the car manufacturer that the market will be there, but it's also helping to decrease the cost for purchasing those vehicles. And to some extent, if you focus, for example, on the potential of fleet, you can certainly create very rapidly a second-hand market for those cars, and probably which will be cheaper as well, right? So this one is critical, like also all the announcements to create emission zones. Whatever enables to have more vehicles and certainly help, because we used to say the charger follows the car. So as soon as you have the cars, you install the chargers from the private sector, of course. Then having some targets for network deployments, like the European Commission has just proposed in the proposal for the regulation on alternative fuel infrastructure, is certainly very good, to also complement this lack of harmonization across countries, particularly in Europe, because we drive cross-border and we want to be able to charge equally in France, in Italy, in Western and Eastern Europe. But there are a couple of additional points. I think this charging network needs to be integrated and interoperable. And here we go into the nitty-gritty details of standardization again, communication protocols, roaming, which is something which we inherited also from the telecom industry, but it's beyond cross-border. It's just that all the chargers installed should be able to communicate with each other. And you as a driver, you should be able to charge a charger one, A, B, or C with the same subscription, with the same card, right? On top, of course, of being able to charge with your credit card, which is an obligation in Europe according for public station. Two last points. As I said, it's a combination. EV charging, it's also a lot of data management, the data from the driver, the data from the car, the data from the network, how much energy is available and when. And this needs to be handled safely. So policy can help to provide that security. And last but not least, and this is a topic I guess you know more than me about, it's also to enable smart charging. This is where the electric car becomes a source of flexibility for the network, right? Question is more, it's not so much about the technology, but more maybe about the economics around that. and what's the business model, where are the electricity market rules to really valorize, I would say, this flexibility at the level of an EV. So I would stop there, but I would say that these are probably the key policy enablers to really foster private investment in EV charging infrastructure.
Excellent. Many thanks, Christelle. So the third speaker is Bjorn Otto Sverdrup, who is Equinor's Senior Vice President for Corporate Sustainability and a member of the Management Committee in the Global Strategy and Business Development of Business Area. Now, since February 2021, Bjorn Otto became the chairman of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative Executive Committee. And in this quality, he's responsible for advancing and implementing the strategy set by OGCI CEOs. Now, Bjorn, oil and natural gas will definitely play a very important role in the transition, and they will stay there in the energy system for many years to come. Even in our net zero emission, they not disappear entirely in the longer term. And yet, we estimate that oil and gas operations are directly responsible for around 15% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions today. Now, could you please elaborate on how the industry prepares itself for the new energy economy and the possibility of declining oil and gas demand? And maybe to also elaborate more in detail, what are the objectives of OGCI? Thank you, Bjorn. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Paolo. These are huge questions, of course. Could I just first say big thanks to IEA for both producing extremely valuable reports, systematically, but also hosting sessions like this, bringing different sectors, because we need to work together more quickly and forcefully going forward to drive change. So should I just rush to say that I spend most of my time on OGCI now, Paolo? And OGCI, for those of you who don't know, brings together 12 of the largest oil and gas companies in the world, with around 30% of the production. The purpose is to drive climate action inside that industry. I think what we're talking about today, right in the middle of that challenge, sits the oil and gas industry. It needs to transition itself, and it has a key role to play to help others successfully transition. So this is one way of looking at it, Paolo. As you said, to produce and provide oil and gas, we have a lot of emissions related to that. And it's actually nearly 7% of world total emissions are related to the production of oil and gas worldwide. So the challenge is fairly clear, and I'm very glad that all of the CEOs of the OGCI companies now are sharing the ambition to say, we're going to go for net zero emissions when it comes to scope 1 and 2. Very sizable. A big part of that is to eliminate methane. That is around 50% of the challenge we talked about. And that is, of course, particularly important. On that area, I'm actually also a bit optimistic, because we have shown that it is possible to bring those emissions down. Within the last 4 years, inside the 12 companies, we've managed to bring those down with around 30%. Going forward, we need to, be even more forceful in both developing the needed technologies, but also perhaps even more importantly, to implement it, right? And to change both our mindsets and also the practices around methane. As we go along, also the companies need to look at their portfolios. So what does a future fit oil and gas portfolio look like? Knowing that over time, there's going to be there needs to be a transition in the overall kind of system. So to me, this is the 4 gigaton challenge, the scope 1 and 2. But it's also, of course, the 16 gigaton challenge, as I call it. That is the total emissions from oil and gas. And here, I think the industry has a big opportunity, and they can play a key role both to invest in new energy sources, be that renewables or, known things. So that is about investment and shifting capital over time. The second thing is to develop new solutions. we talked about carbon capture and storage. Martin talked about the need for hydrogen going forward. We can also envision synthetic fuels, biofuels, and add that to the list, as well as batteries and storage and all those future components of the energy system going forward. And finally, and I think this is underexplored, but of course, this industry is massive. And each year it's investing massively into new investments. And it has a role also to, incentivize and send signals to new sectors, be that steel, be that shipping or cement or others, to say, hey, we are actually ready to be there when you're coming with lower carbon products. So Paolo, I think the oil and gas industry, even if some would like it to go away, like magic overnight, also can be turned into an incredible force to drive the broader economic transition that we're basically talking about. It's not only the economic, energy system that needs to change, but it's a very deep and profound transition of the economy needed. Thanks.
Thank you. And I like your words of no magic solution, but turning into a very important force for change. Now, before I go to my second round of quick questions, I would like to remind the audience to put their questions in the chat. Some of the listeners are already doing that, so this will be important. Then we still want to have a few questions from the floor. But let me ask something that actually already emerges in this first session. So your industry sectors are interconnected. And actually what you are doing in one sector will influence the others. Now, let me go again to Martin. The steel industry occupies, of course, a critical place in the economy with a lot of upstream and downstream linkages, and most importantly, international trade. You didn't touch it, but of course you produce a commodity which is incredibly traded internationally, and you're exposed to international competition. Now, how do you see the role of policies in facilitating the emergence of green steel, in particular in creating demand or ensuring the supply of key inputs like low carbon hydrogen, which was one of the new solutions that Bjorn just mentioned about? So how could green steel be indirectly pushed by policy action on the supply fuel? Thank you.
Yes, it is an extremely important aspect. Steel is extremely important in the economy. From mining to steel applications, steel plays the critical step to provide material to make our modern society possible. Also, as just you mentioned, Paolo, it is very much a traded material. It is a very competitive product on the market. So that's why to make this transition possible, we see there is a significant role that policymakers can do. First of all, number one is to create a market demand for such a steel. And we have seen quite a number of customers that are extremely interested in making agreements with SSAB when we are now planning for the first commercial scale production. That is to say very good. We have a voluntary bilateral agreement. But on top of that, we see clearly a need to create a level playing field so the first movers are not punished in the context of a global competition. There are a lot of discussion ongoing, and here I believe that we should try to support first movers to make this transition possible. Then it will drive scale up efficiency improvements, and next step, more companies do this transition. We can have the technology available at a much more efficient scale. So important aspects.
Thank you so much. I would like to go back to mobility 1 second. And looking again this from a business model perspective, because there is no doubt that electrifying transport means a disruption of existing business models and strategies across the whole value chain of transport. Now, how can policy help, not just in giving incentives, or maybe these are not even needed if you looked at the IEA analysis of how many electric vehicles can be cost competitive, but at the same time, how can we make sure that there is a just and equitable transition for existing manufacturers and business owners? To what extent do you perceive this as an important challenge for your sector? Because of course, social acceptance of the transition will be key in order to go to the scale that we need. We cannot have winners and losers. We need to be all winners in somehow. Christel, what is your opinion on this?
I agree, Paolo, and it's true. It's going to be disruptive, and we have to all do our best to manage this, right, to happen. Of course, we stand on the EV charging side, so for us, it's more an opportunity more than anything. It's a new market. These are new opportunities. It's more a question, as I said earlier, to have the right standards in place, the right policy framework in place. But on top of that, I think the major disruption will probably happen on the car manufacturer sides, which will have to adjust, of course. So first of all, it's all about addressing those changes through the manufacturing chain, but also making sure that there is a market, like it was said right earlier by the previous speaker. It's to create and to generate the demand. And for that, we have already spoke earlier about how policy should help that. However, I think that public investment, if well targeted, should at least support the ramp up of e-mobility. And I insist on the fact that they should be targeted, because you're right, there is a business model to invest in the private charging infrastructure. If you think, I mean, the time that your car is parked, which is most of the time, that's all an opportunity to charge it. And you can combine it with additional services from retail industry, from hotels, from workplaces. That's fine. But there's going to be some failure in there. And you may want to be able to charge in every place where you go. Well, that's maybe where public investment should somehow help to address those specific needs, or at least to address them to top up where the private investment will not fulfill, or where the utilization rate of the station at a certain time will not be sufficient. But for that, they need to be very well targeted. And on top of that, but here we go more through an industrial policy discussion, which is beyond electromobility. It's to create probably the right industry to manufacture those cars, as we said earlier, to manufacture those batteries, to recycle those batteries as well, because I think acceptance will come certainly about the cost, but also about the sustainable footprint that these vehicles, the charging station and beyond will have. So again, it's more an ecosystem approach here, and public investment can help, but if well targeted, in order not to disrupt the market.
Thank you so much, Christel. I go back to Bjorn, and you mentioned explicitly the big opportunity for the gas and oil industry to invest directly in new solutions from CCUS to renewables. Now, however, from our perspective, we observe that so far, a relatively small share of the industry capex is currently going in these new investments. Can you tell us a little bit more where companies, in your opinion, are making progress, and by contrast, what is holding them back to a faster commitment in these new investments? And last but certainly not least, how can policy help?
Yeah, so in short, I think we're starting to see a major transformation happening. So it's not complete, but it's for sure underway. And you know, to use a term from the industry, I think actually this can, looking back in a few years from now, is going to be seen as a tectonic shift. So oil and gas companies starting to see themselves as energy companies. Renewables is becoming the fastest growth area, but also, you know, eating up quite a big chunk of the investment capital. Using cash flow is starting to flow directly, and also investment decisions are scrutinized differently. So boardrooms are talking about climate-related risks. They're talking about shorter-term monetization of oil and gas. But of course, you need to balance that also towards the longer-term needs of society and to avoid economic shortages or dislocations or even blackouts or shortages of energy. So it's a very fine balance between the needs of climate, the needs of nature against the needs of fairness, the welfare, as well as the energy access. So, but I think all of this and what you're seeing is that there are a couple of areas, particularly in the renewable space, that some of the oil and gas companies are becoming actually some of the more dominant players now. Looking at where policy is going to be important to decide the pace of this change, and can I just point to 3 different areas where I believe policy is going to be really important? First, you need to start putting a price on carbon. To me, it's a no-brainer, but I think it's striking that so many countries still don't have that, and we need to do that. Secondly, to accelerate investments into renewables, there are too few projects available at a large scale. So we need much more permitting, much more acreage being made available to really drive that forward much quicker. It takes too long to build the project at scale needed. And thirdly, when it comes to carbon capture and storage, we are, our members are currently involved in 25 such projects. There needs more speed on regulatory clarifications. You need to have permitting when it comes to pipelines. There are some risk storage protocols that needs to be decided. So clearly, again, and this is on that area particularly, perhaps a public-private partnership needed. So there are key areas where I believe politicians could be intervening now that could really make a big shift. Thanks.
Thanks to you, and thank you in particular for being so direct and on these 3 areas for policy action, which I actually fully agree with. Now we have a few questions coming from the audience. I would like to pick one, the first one, if you can go up, because it was on recycling, and it's a question both to the IEA, I would say, and to Martin. Can you go up? Can you in the chat? Anyway, the question to the IEA was whether in our estimation of the cost, when we say that renewables, for instance, are cost competitive, do we consider the circular economy dynamics and the cost of recycling and of disposal? Don't you think that this may change the future outlook? This is a question to Stephanie and Tim, but it's also a question to Martin. How do you see this recycling from renewables? Of course, this is maybe only a small part of your market. Is this an opportunity or is this a threat for your industry sector? Tim and Stephanie, if you want to intervene on the first. I'm not sure they are connected.
Thanks, Paolo. Yep, I'm here,
please.
but I can't activate the video. Okay, so yeah, that great question on recycling and circular economy in power sector and the influence on costs. So I think we need to consider here that obviously all power sector and all electricity generating technologies are going to have some costs associated with the end of their operational lives. How do we phase down and then remediate the sites after the end of the lifetime of the plant? And so obviously when we think of fossil fuel plants, there's quite some significant costs there. For nuclear, we can have projects running over decades to remediate these plants. And now obviously renewables, they're going to have costs as well. And there is really this emerging industry of recycling of the components of solar PV modules. But obviously when we look about at wind turbines, there's steel there that can be fed back into scrap industries. And and really help to ensure that we're maximizing the share of iron and steel that's being able to be recycled and then used in these electric arc furnaces rather than having to start from a primary raw product again. So there's definitely benefits that we can tap into with a ramping up of recycling of these components coming out of renewables at the end of their lifetimes, and it's something that we're seeing on a small scale at the moment, but definitely in the outlooks is going to need to increase.
Thank you so much. I wish just to add on this that the IEA Technology Network has a long-standing work on this. So for instance, the PVPS Technology Collaboration Program has a program on environment and safety and recycling since 2012. So this is something that the industry has very well present. But Martin, the question is also to you. In a circular economy for your business is a threat or is another opportunity?
It's definitely an opportunity. Already today, steel is one of the most recycled material in our, say, industry. Currently, there is not enough steel scrap coming back, and we see this will grow in the future. So we are as the industry working very hard in trying to influence the design of products, in manufacturing processes to use steel in a better way, so that the steel product can last longer, more durable. In that way, we can reduce the need for virgin production need. But also, I want to mention the steel industry itself is extremely integrated with the rest of the industry. A lot of, say, one of the big area for a byproduct that comes from steel production is used in the cement industry, that which will save a lot of, say, virgin material to make cement. We have also fully integrated energy system where we have steel production facilities. We have quite a significant amount of residual heat. Normally, that is distributed to district heating, for example, in cold areas. So we are optimizing whatever possible in order to save resources. So circularity, it will be even more important in the future for the steel industry.
Thank you so much. Now, some questions are coming, and I try to summarize a few of them, which are asking what should we do, in particular in emerging and developing economies that are lagging behind. There is one question on China, but there is a question also more on developing countries. And you mentioned, Bern, the carbon pricing. You said this is a no-brainer. But how do we apply this no-brainer to developing economies, and what is a just and fair application of a carbon price in taking into account the different status of the economic development and at the same time of a global market?
So when I say carbon price, to me, that's a shorthand for saying that we need to find ways of, rewarding low carbon solutions and penalizing somehow the more heavy ones. So let's take Sweden for an example, or Norway. So Norway is going to a signal that's going to go to $200 per ton for CO2 tax. So that is clearly driving change. But of course, in India or another country, that kind of incentive could be perhaps $1 or $2. So there's going to, I think the idea of one price globally, it may be utopian. We're not there. It wouldn't be fair at all. So you need to find structure, ways to use the force of the market to drive that change, to make sure that you reward what you would like to see more of. So that easy, basically.
Thank you. And thank you implicitly also to supporting the IEA approach on this, which is exactly a differentiated look for sectors and regions in the world. Now, there are a number of other questions. I would like to give one on mobility. And here we have one which is on green hydrogen versus fuel cell cars and electric vehicles. And I would come to you, Christelle. How you feel about that? You see hydrogen as a competitor. We know that in some countries there is a push for hydrogen also in transport? Or again, is it a rather complementary solution, which in the end will foster more competition and it's actually a good thing? Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question, Paolo. You're right. I mean, it's often brought up, and there is indeed some political, but also market developments on that standpoint. I think it all boils down on the use cases and the needs, right? I mean, is it really economic? Does it make sense from an economic point of view to massively deploy hydrogen cars and hydrogen refueling station, considering that on the other hand, the electricity network is already there, that OEMs have already invested massively in the deployment of low emission, cars and vehicles, electric ones, I mean. Now, the question might be different for heavy duty vehicles, right? Where there is a different use cases, where the charging pattern will be totally different. And there it might make sense actually to develop also the network to recharge those vehicles. So honestly, I don't see that as a competition. It's more a question to identify where it would make sense to go from one technology or the other one. I personally believe that electric mobility works very well for private cars and smaller vehicles. I think the question is valid for more heavy duty ones, yes.
So thank you so much. Can I ask you something again, Christelle, just to remain to you 1 second? What is, because I come to one point that Bjorn made, which is the scale.
Yeah.
Now it's obvious that there are industries like gas and oil and the or steel that are logically immediately going to large scale products. But in your case, the scale can be an issue. Now, what is the potential role of cities in this respect, for instance, to create an aggregated demand, or how do you see the problem of scale?
Well, you're touching at the right point. And as I was pointing earlier, e-mobility, it's a combination of many different policies. It's mobility, it's climate, it's digital. I think it's also a different level of power and responsibilities. Of course, you can get the vision from a national, even European level in our case, but certainly regions and cities have a massive power to generate and create that scale. And you may have noticed, I mean, in those cities where indeed there has been the impulse to deploy low emission zones or just restrict the access to certain types of vehicles, it's also an opportunity to encourage, again, the citizens to invest in some form of vehicles. Now, it all boils down also to the social acceptance, right? At the end, I mean, if you need a car to go to work and you live outside of the city, it also goes with the right public transport network to be rightly developed from that standpoint as well. So it's more a question of integrated mobility policies, I would say here. But you're right, there is a role also at that level to have the right scale to make sure that the demand is there for the vehicles and therefore also for the chargers. And the chargers for the right needs. I mean, you don't install fast chargers everywhere. It doesn't make sense. It's very expensive. So it's more a question of identifying, again, the right use cases and the right needs.
Thank you so much. I come to the last question, which will be the same for all the speakers. And I ask you to be really, really succinct. It stems from one question from the audience, which we're asking for at least 10 topmost transition priorities. Now, this is too much. I will transform this question into, you have only one choice. If you can only ask one thing from policymakers, what would you ask? Either in your governments or at COP26, what your most important policy priority in your wish list is what? Who wants to go first?
I can go.
Please,
From us, we see the most important thing is great market demand for fossil-free or really low carbon steel. That's the most important aspect.
Excellent. Super fast, super clear. Bjorn.
A bit boring, but I think actually I need to say carbon pricing, because I think that has the power to play over to a great deal of transitions.
Thank you so much. Christelle, the last word is yours.
Last word, I would say act fast. Policy is needed. We already told it, but the market is growing. The demand is there. We need the right policy framework in place now. And for that, we need the support of decision makers. Yes, fast.
Excellent. We have so many other questions coming, but of course, because of the time, we cannot respond to all of them. But I'm sure our World Energy Outlook colleagues will follow up in some way. Please join me in applauding the speakers, my colleagues, for the presentation. This is a very interesting topic which will remain crucially important in the transition. I thank you so much for your attention, and I wish you a very nice continuation of the day or the evening or the morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.